Welcome. Thank you for joining us for First Person Conversations with Holocaust Survivors. My name is Bill Benson. I've hosted the museum's First Person program since it began in 2000. Each month, we bring you firsthand accounts of survival of the Holocaust. Each of our first person guests serve as a volunteer at the museum. We are honored to have Holocaust survivor Al Munzer share his personal firsthand account of the Holocaust with us. Al, thank you so much for agreeing to be our first person.
Delighted to be with you, Bill.
Thank you, Al. And I know you have so much to share with us, so we'll start right away. Before you tell us what happened to you and your family during World War II and the Holocaust, let's begin with you telling us about your parents and their lives prior to the rise of Nazism.
Well, both my parents were born in Eastern Europe. My father, Simcha, was born in a small town called Kanchuga, and my mother, Gitel or Giselle, was born in a neighboring town about 40 miles away called Rimanov. They both came from fairly large traditional Orthodox families. These towns were part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the province of Galicia, until the First World War. After the First World War, they became part of Poland. And as time went by, there was a rise in anti-Semitism, and also there were very few opportunities for young people and a real desire on the part of young people to get away from the strictures of Orthodox Judaism, and so many of them decided to seek their fortunes elsewhere. Uh, Both my parents left their homes when they were about 18 or perhaps 21 years old, the earliest time that they could get a passport to get out. Both my parents went initially to the big go-to city in Europe at the time, and that was Berlin. My father remained in Berlin for a relatively short period of time, then went on to the Netherlands, to the city of The Hague, where he started his men's clothing business. My mother, on the other hand, remained in Berlin, where she had joined two older siblings, a sister Fega and her uh, brother Abraham, and she remained there until the end of 1932. And at that point, she joined my father in The Hague, and that's where they were married in December 1932, just
And,
about the time, by the way, when Adolf Hitler came to power in neighboring Germany.
and here, of course, we see them on their wedding day.
Yes,
Al, your
yes,
parents
yes,
your parents would then have two daughters. Will you tell us about your older sisters, Eva and Leah?
sure. My sister, Eva, my father's business really flourished. He did quite well in his clothing business. He had picked the city of The Hague for his business because it was the seat of government and also had many embassies. And so it was very much a city where people dressed in suits and ties. And so this was good for his business. Anyway, my parents also made many friends during that period of time. And then in July 1936 is when they celebrated the birth of their first child, and that is my sister Eva, standing on the right. And 2 years later, uh, on November 11th, 1938, they celebrated the birth of their second child, and that was my sister Leah, here on the left. That date, November 11th, 1938, you will remember is actually just 3 days after Kristallnacht, the night of broken glass, when the full fury of anti Semitism was unleashed in neighboring Germany. But in Holland, just a few hundred miles away, my parents continued to feel very safe, as did other Jews.
Al, you mentioned that your parents had large families. Did you in the Netherlands? Did you have uncles and aunts and cousins?
No, I do not. In fact, I know very little about their siblings. The only sibling I know anything about on my mother's side is my uncle Abraham, who managed to leave Germany with his family, with his wife and son, for South America, for Bolivia. And to this day, I still have relatives in
Mhm.
South America and specifically in Bolivia. And on my father's side, the only person I know about, the only sibling, uh, is my uncle Emil. He joined my father about a year after my father came to the Netherlands, and also worked in the same business of as a tailor. And here he is on the far left, Emil, my uncle Emil, holding my sister Leah, and on the right is my father holding my sister Eva, and of course my mother sitting somewhere in the middle. A big photograph that was probably taken sometime uh, in 1939, looking at the ages of my sisters.
Al, on September 1st, 1939, Germany's invasion of Poland launched World War II. The following May of 1940, the Netherlands was attacked by Germany. Please tell us what the German invasion meant for your family and for the other Jews in the Netherlands.
But until the actual invasion, Jews had felt very, very safe in Holland. Jews had lived in the Netherlands for hundreds of years. And in addition to that, Holland had succeeded in remaining neutral during the First World War, and so did not have any, had every hope of not to be invaded by Germany this time around. But that, of course, did not happen. My mother has shared a very distinct memory of what happened May 10th, 1940. She told me that the evening before, they had been asked to host a man who was a member of the Dutch resistance movement. And he had a briefcase with him, according to my mother, to preemptively destroy the railroad center in the city of Utrecht in the hope that that would slow down any invasion coming from Germany. But the following morning, as they listened, turned on the radio, listened to the news, they heard that the port city of Rotterdam had been bombed by German planes. And of course, that was sort of the beginning of the end. The first person to speak up that day, my mother told me, was their guest, the man from the Dutch resistance movement. And he said in Dutch, "Goddank, het is ten einde. Thank God, it's over." As far as he was concerned, he had been part of the resistance movement. He had done what he could to slow down any invasion, but he felt that it was now inevitable that the Netherlands would be taken over by Germany, and he felt that any future sacrifice of Dutch soldiers would be unfortunate and would be on, and so would be a loss. And so that's why he said, "Thank God, it's over."
And of
But
course,
for
the
him, it would
Germans,
have to accommodate, to the
right?
occupation. But for my parents, they knew what had happened to their relatives in Germany and in Poland, and they knew they were going to be in for a very, very difficult time.
And Al, as they obviously anticipated, it would not be long after their occupation that the Nazis began imposing restrictions on Jews in the Netherlands. Tell us about some of those restrictions that your family faced.
Well, the earliest restriction that was put in place was a ban on ritual slaughter of animals for kosher meat, something that might seem benign. But then after that, all sorts of other regulations were put in place. Jews had to take on a new middle name. Men, Israel, women, Sarah, so they could always be identified as being Jewish. Eventually, their identification documents were stamped with a big J. uh, Eventually, they had to surrender their bicycles, even. And, they had to register all their property so that it would be easier for that property eventually to be confiscated. So a gradual imposition of all sorts of regulations meant to isolate the Jewish community and to humiliate the Jewish community. For example, there was one rule prohibiting Jews from going into public parks, which made absolutely no sense.
And will you tell us about an incident that your mother described to you?
Yes, my mother, so when you have a regulation that makes absolutely no sense, you tend to ignore it. And so my mother continued to take my sister Leah in her babe stroller into the park in our neighborhood. And then one day, my mother told me, a German woman approached the baby carriage. And my mother told me her heart almost stopped because she knew she wasn't supposed to be there. But then the woman approached the baby carriage, started playing with my sister's blonde curls, pointed to her blue eyes, and smiled and said to my mother, "Ah, you can tell that this is good Aryan blood." That crazy racist ideology suddenly coming to the fore. My mother thanked the woman and, of course, left the park and never went back into that park again.
Al, did your sisters have the ability to start school during that time?
My younger sister, Leah, probably was not old enough to go to school, but very soon Eva was prohibited from going to a public school. And so at that point is when my parents, with the help of two neighbors that they had befriended, the Van Derwen sisters, my sisters were placed in a Catholic school. My older sister, at least at that time, was placed in a Catholic school. Eventually, she was joined there by my sister Leah as well.
Al, you were, of course, then to follow your two sisters. You were born November 23rd, 1941, almost 19 months after the Nazi occupation of the Netherlands began. In the midst of such circumstances, your parents' joy over having another child must have been accompanied by profound fears. What can you tell us about how your parents were feeling at that time with respect to your birth?
When my mother found out that she was pregnant again, she consulted her obstetrician. And this was, of course, at a terrible time. Not only were Jews being subjected to all of the regulations that I mentioned earlier, but in addition to that, there had already been a roundup of Jews in the city of Amsterdam who were ended up in a concentration camp in Mauthausen. And this was fairly well generally known, actually. So under those circumstances, my mother must have been terribly, terribly afraid. And it was no wonder that her obstetrician advised her in no uncertain terms to have an abortion, to terminate the pregnancy. Now, my mother wasn't particularly religious at the time, but she did turn to the Bible for advice. And she read the story of a woman called Hannah. And Hannah, you might remember, was a woman who would go to the temple every year and pray that she might conceive. And it was in reading of Hannah's agonizing desire to have a child that my mother decided she could not possibly have an abortion. And so, indeed, November 23rd, 1941, I was born at home without the obstetrician, who refused to have anything further to do with my mother, but with the help of a nurse.
And of course, this is you shortly after your birth.
Exactly.
Al, it's a custom in Jewish tradition for male babies to have a circumcision ceremony. That created a dilemma for your parents as well. Will you tell us about that?
Sure. Well, my parents' friends advised them very strongly don't have him circumcised. It will always identify him as being Jewish. But this time, the answer to my parents' dilemma came in the form of the worried look on the face of a pediatrician who had just examined me. And my father asked him, "Is there something wrong with the baby?" But then the pediatrician smiled and said, "No, it's just that your son needs a minor operation we call a circumcision." And so my father told him of our Jewish tradition, and indeed, 8 days later, family and friends gathered in our home for the observance of this first milestone in a Jewish life. It may well have been the last such gathering in the city of The Hague, certainly one of the last.
Al, this picture is of great significance to you. Will you tell us about it?
These pictures are very, very special. They're only about 1 by 1.5 inch in size. They were taken at the circumcision ceremony. And my mother was to keep these two small photographs hidden on her body through her subsequent stay in 12 concentration camps. And she developed this superstition that if she ever lost these photographs, it would mean that I had been killed. Fortunately, my mother survived, I survived, and the photographs survived. And the photographs are now part of the collection of the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum. And here on this photo,
I was just say each of the fact that your mother survived is remarkable, but the fact that these photographs remain with her throughout that entire ordeal is really stunning.
yes, it is. It's really, really amazing. And they are and remain very, very special to me. And I'm glad that they're being saved, cared for at the museum. And here on the photograph, we see a few people that I've mentioned earlier. Circled on the far left, you can see my father, and then right below him is my sister Eva. And then to the left, or their right, is my sister Leah, looking actually at my sister Eva. And then in the circle above, you can see my uncle Emil, the man with the hat, and to his right is his fiancée, Ellie, whose last name I unfortunately never learned.
Al, in the summer of 1942, the Germans began systematically deporting Jews from the Netherlands to killing centers in German-occupied Poland. As conditions worsened by September, your parents decided that the family must go into hiding. What convinced your parents to do that? And tell us about their decision to find hiding.
Well, my father received a notice to report for so-called labor duty, which he knew meant going to a concentration camp. First, a concentration camp in Holland, but then with a strong likelihood of being sent actually east. And so he first avoided going to that labor camp by submitting to a hernia operation that he had delayed for a long time. And that, gained him some time. But then, of course, he knew that he was going to be called again, and he did receive a second notice. And at that point, my parents decided that we ought to go into hiding like so many other Jews were doing. Now, some Jewish families, like the famous family of Anne Frank, went into hiding as one family unit. But in the case of my family, my parents decided that as a form of insurance, so that if they were taken, at least their children would have a chance to survive, we would hide in separate places. So the first one to go into hiding was my father, since he had received that notice, and went into hiding in a psychiatric hospital, the Klinik, where he joined 250 other Jews who were in hiding there. after pretending to commit an act of suicide. That's what gained him admission there.
How did your mother then, with your father in this psychiatric facility as a patient, how did your mother care for the three of you? She now has three young kids. How was she able to do that?
My mother told me that that was one of the most frightening times of her life. She told me that she was so afraid that the doorbell might ring, indicating that a German or Nazi officer might be coming to the house, that she covered the doorbell, the clapper of the doorbell, with a piece of cloth. And then she told me she spent the entire night sitting on the stairwell watching the clapper to see if it moved.
Mm.
Incredibly frightening times until she was able to find a place for my sisters and myself. And this is a photograph that I absolutely adore. It's the only picture that I have of me with my sisters. And I imagine that in this photograph, I was probably about 6, 7 months old. And you can see my sister Eva holding on to my arm, and my sister Leah uh, pulling her short arm around me in a protective way. This expression of protection of their little brother uh, just is incredibly moving for me whenever I look at this photograph.
Al, what arrangements then did your mother make to put your sisters into hiding?
My sisters were placed initially with two neighbors, two women who were very devout Catholics, and uh, they agreed to take my two sisters at least until a more permanent hiding place could be found for them. They were the Van Leeuwen sisters who lived next door to us. Uh, that left my mother with me, and then a neighbor who lived across the street, a woman by the name of Annie Madna, agreed to take care of me. And it's at that point, of course, my mother brought me to Annie Madma across the street with a bundle of my blankets, uh, ration stamps, so I could have food and some toys. And then my mother at that point joined my father in the same psychiatric hospital where he was in hiding. In her case, not as a patient, but as a nursing assistant, actually.
So
My
she
mother
actually
told me,
found employment in that same psychiatric hospital.
yes, my mother told me that it was really her first exposure to mental illness. And sometimes when she thought about the world outside, she wondered where the mental illness really resided. Was it inside the hospital or in the world gone mad all around her? Uh, my parents had a surprise on Christmas Day, 1942, when my two sisters were brought to them on a visit. And so for a short time, at least part of the family, the Munzer family, was reunited in that psychiatric hospital. And it's probably during that visit that my parents gave permission for my sisters to be baptized, which happened uh, January 14th, 1943.
And Al, you were not able to have any such reunification or visit as your sisters did.
No, I did not.
No, no. I imagine all of our viewers are just trying to think about and imagine the profound decision that your parents made to go into hiding and to hide their daughters and then you separately from them. I just can't imagine how terrifying and heartbreaking that must have been. Al, in December 1942, your parents, along with other Jews who were hiding in that hospital, were arrested by German police. Tell us about that.
On December 31st, 1942, New Year's Eve, the hospital, the Rebar was invaded by the Nazis, and all 250 patients who had been hiding there were arrested and sent first to a temporary prison in the former home of Spinoza, the Dutch Jewish philosopher. A prison created in that place, part of, I guess, typical Nazi mentality. They only remained there for a very short period of time because at that point, all of them were taken to Westerbork. Westerbork was a concentration camp in the northern part of Holland. And that was the first of a whole series of concentration camps my parents were to visit.
Your your mother, I think, shared with you what daily life was like for her when she went to another camp called Wood. Will you tell us about that?
Yes, well, my mother told me first that Westerbork she did not find too unpleasant. It had been built as a receiving center for Jewish immigrants, for Jewish refugees. Of course, eventually it became massively overcrowded. My parents, after a few months, were taken to another concentration camp that you just mentioned, Vught. And in Vught, they were assigned to do slave labor again. Uh, Initially, I don't know exactly what my father did, but my mother initially was assigned to making fur coats, which, to her great unhappiness, were actually for the wives of Nazi officers. But then, after a while, she was assigned to do work for the Philips Electronics factory. The actual factory had been bombed, but then the head of the factory, Fritz Philips, had been persuaded by the Germans to reopen a place of work, a factory in the concentration camp, so they could use slave labor for things that were essential for the German war effort. He agreed to that on condition that the prisoners would be well treated, be adequately fed, and have a place to eat, and would not be abused. And my mother was fortunate to join that group called the Philips Commando, where she was assigned to make uh, radio tubes, which she soon learned were essential for the German war effort.
Although your mother had initially hidden you with a neighbor, Annie Madna, it soon became unsafe for you to stay there. Tell us about the arrangements that Annie then made for you.
At- Annie was somewhat older, and so she almost immediately passed me on to her younger sister. And that was the Polak family, and Jorina and Turnus Polak. And Dini Polak, who fortunately is still alive, their youngest daughter, who was then 6 years old, filled me in on some of the details. She told me that I slept in bed between her parents, but that unfortunately I wasn't very happy and that I was crying a lot, just unhappy about the big change from the home that I had been with my parents, probably. And
Mhm.
so the Polacks were afraid that a Dutch Nazi neighbor might hear me. And so after 3 weeks being there, they reluctantly parted with me. And that's why I ended up being placed with the Madna family, Annie Madna's former husband, uh, the three children, uh, and of course, most importantly, the nanny who had taken care of the three children and who now, for all practical purposes, became my mother.
What can you tell us about Mima?
Yes, Mima Saina was Indonesian, just like Tole Madna. Tole Madna had come to the Netherlands. I was born in Indonesia, but came to the Netherlands in 1916. And Mima came to the Netherlands probably around 1926. Mima was had never learned to read or write, came from a very poor background, uh, and did not speak a word of the Dutch language, only her native Indonesian language. And she always wore her traditional Indonesian Javanese dress. And here I am being held by Mima. Mima had a heart of gold, and she would walk miles every day, I'm told, just to get milk for me. I was with the Monna family illegally, so there were no ration coupons to get food for me. So they all had to share their meager rations with me, and Mima had to go out and find milk for me. And I'm told that I slept in Mima's bed and that she kept a knife under her pillow, vowing to kill any Nazi who might try to come and get me.
What are some of your earliest memories in your adoptive household?
Most of the memories that I have with the Monna house in the Monna household are very happy ones. I didn't know
Mhm.
what was going on the outside. And so here is a photograph that shows me being held by Mima. I'm probably about, 2, 3 years old here. And on the right, it's Tole Matna, I always called Papa for the rest of his life. Davy Matna in the middle, then Vil Matna holding a little dog. And all Jewish children who were placed in hiding were given a new name. And I was given the name Bobby. And to this day, that's members of the Matna family call me. And for many years, I thought I was called Bubby after the little dog. But then a few years ago, I shared that with Davy Madna, standing here in the middle, and she started to laugh. And she said, "Oh, no," she said, "you're wrong. The dog's name wasn't Bobby, the dog's name was Teddy." So there went that particular theory. There were times when I would have to go into hiding in a closet or a small cellar because the house was being searched. Uh, but that's when I thought it was a game of hide and seek, and I would play with the Christmas decorations that were hidden there, that were kept there. And so, again, that wasn't an unhappy memory either.
Al, during that time that you were with the Madna family, were you ever able to go outside?
Probably, perhaps very early on, Papa Magna, according to the family and speaking to them, took me out in a stroller. And, when people pointed to the baby, the little boy in the stroller, and asked them, "Well, who is that?" He would simply say, "It's my son." And they might have a puzzled look on their face, but that's all he would tell them.
Mhm, mhm.
And then, but later on, subsequently, I was really never allowed out of the house. That would have been much too dangerous. In fact, the only view that I had of the outside world was what I could see through a mail slot. That was all I could see. I was not even allowed to come close to a window for fear that people on the outside might see a very different looking child. There was one exception. There were some children who were allowed, of course, to come in and play with me. And they are portrayed in this particular photograph. And it shows the third of the Matna children. I'm on the tricycle, and behind me is the third of the Matna children, Robbie or Rob Matna. And I was probably called Bobby because that name is so close to Robbie. So people would just confuse one with the other. And then the two other children are Helga Friederici and Arthur Friederici. Until about a year ago, I did not know their first names, only the last name. And then Arthur Friederici read an article in a newspaper that had a photograph of me being held by Mima. And he said, I recognize that little baby. I used to play with him. He contacted the author. It was actually the review of a book about the Indonesian Dutch resistance movement. And the author put him in touch with me, and we started corresponding. And then last October, Arthur Friederici and I were reunited after 75 years. I had no memory of him. I was only 4 years old when we were last together, but he was 6, so he had more of a memory of me.
And Arthur was the little boy on the right-hand side in that photograph.
That's
And
right.
Al, that was just last year.
That's just this last October, and then we saw each other again in May when I was back in Holland.
Oh, amazing, amazing. Al, while you were in hiding with the Madnas, of course, the rest of your family had a very different experience. After staying with the next door neighbors for a year, your two sisters, Eva and Leah, were moved to the home of a Catholic woman. Uh, will you tell us about what happened to them after that?
Yes, the parish priest, Father Ludders, had been charged or had taken charge of finding what he thought would be a safer place for my sisters. And he found one, he thought, with a woman called Rosa Mazurowski and her husband, who operated a small guest house. And I thought that might be, he thought, might be a safe place for my sisters. So that's where they were placed sometime in October 1943. But then, a few months later, in February of 1944, uh, the husband of the woman denounced his wife as hiding 2 Jewish children. And his wife was immediately, they were all, my sisters and his wife were immediately arrested. His wife was sent to a prison near The Hague, and then on a few months later to several concentration camps, but survived. My two sisters, however, were immediately taken to Westerbork and from there to Auschwitz, where they were killed February 11th, 1944. They were only 5 and 7 years old. And this is probably the very last photograph taken of them while they were attending a Catholic school, while in hiding with either the Van Deuren sisters or with Rosa Mazurowski. So I never got to meet my sisters. They were two of 1.5 million children who lost their lives in the Holocaust.
And now, on that same transport that took your sisters to their death, you also lost another family member.
Yes, on that same transport, looking at the list of people deported, was the name of my uncle Emil. And we surmised that he found out that my sisters had been taken and that they were going to be deported. And he did not want them to go alone. So he joined my sisters in that same transport, and he was killed that same day on arrival in Auschwitz, February 11th, 1944.
In March of 1944, your father was also sent to Auschwitz. Tell us what happened to your father.
My father, on arrival in Auschwitz, was fortunate, if you will, to be selected for labor duty rather than being sent immediately to the gas chambers. And for a long time, I did not know exactly what kind of work he did in Auschwitz. But then a researcher at the Holocaust Museum showed me a small piece of paper, or an old card actually, which had his number as a prisoner, 175442, no name. And then it said that he was entitled to a premium payment. A payment, of course, not going to him, but a payment going to the command center in Auschwitz. And so I assumed if he deserved was worth a premium payment, that he was probably doing, fairly light, brainy type of work. But then, much more recently, I noticed those words at the very end, KDO Fürstengrube. I'd always assumed that that was the name of a person doing the
Mhm.
authorizing. But then I found out that that was the name of a coal mine, a terrible, terrible place to work. So my father actually worked in a coal mine for mining for coal that was destined for the IG Farben factory, which was also located uh, next to Auschwitz.
And Al, as it turned out, your father was able to survive till the end of the war, but not much longer than that, right?
That's correct. As the Soviet army approached from the east, all of the prisoners who were in Auschwitz were taken on forced marches, death marches as they were called, to a whole series of other camps. My father was taken first to Mauthausen, then to camps called Gösen, Steyr, and Ebensee, all of them located in Austria, Ebensee especially, a beautiful place high in the Austrian Alps where actually The Sound of Music was filmed. In that area, there was this terrible camp where the prisoners, including my father, worked in tunnels underground, abandoned salt mines, assembling V2 rockets for the German army. Terrible work, never seeing daylight, almost no food. Nonetheless, my father survived long enough to witness liberation by the US Army in May 1945. But he was so ill, so debilitated, that he actually died 2 months later after being cared for in a convent in Ebensee. And he lies buried in the Ebensee concentration camp, which is now one huge cemetery. So I never got to know my father. And all I have of my father are some mementos. Uh, this is one especially dear to me. It's my father's pen. And it's one my mother always to carry with me whenever I took a difficult exam as a good luck charm. My mother was also taken to Auschwitz. She remained in Vught until June 1944, and then she was taken also to Auschwitz. Now, fortunately, because she had worked for the Phillips Commando, that group she was with was somewhat protected. So she was sent on from Auschwitz to another camp called Reichenbach, home of the Telefunken electronics factory. And there she continued to do the same kind of work that she had done in Vught, assembling radio tubes. And she told me that radio tubes were really became a symbol, a token of her survival.
And will you tell us about the acts of not just defiance but sabotage that your mother engaged in while she was there?
Yes. My mother, after a few months, the prisoners were joined by German soldiers who had been repatriated from the Eastern Front because they had been severely injured. And they had become so anti Nazi that they did everything possible to sabotage the workings of the factory. And so this encouraged my mother to engage in her own small acts of sabotage. So on occasion, she would spend a whole day assembling one radio tube. Then at the end of the day, when the siren was sounded to go back to the barracks, she would disassemble the radio tube, put all the parts back in the drawer, and start the process all over again the following day. The other act of defiance that my mother told me about was remarkable was the celebration by the prisoners, by the women in her contingent, of the Hanukkah holiday, the Jewish festival of lights. Obviously, they did not have a proper menorah. And so my mother went to the infirmary where she asked for a wad of cotton, telling them that she was having her menstrual period. Before, she hadn't had periods for many, many years. And she impregnated that little wad of cotton with some of the oil from the machine she worked on. It was then planted in a potato, and then the women placed that potato at the window in their barracks, lit this makeshift candle, and sang the traditional songs that go with Hanukkah. The kind of act of defiance that I think is what kept my mother alive.
Mhm. What a remarkable lady she was, Al. I wish we could hear a lot more about her and your time together after the war. And speaking of that, tell us a little bit about how your mother was actually liberated.
My mother was eventually liberated at the Danish border through the intervention of Count Folke Bernadotte, and she and a group of women were then taken to Sweden to recuperate. And she remained there until August 1945. And it's at that point that she was returned to the Netherlands. And that's when I was reunited with my mother.
Will you tell us about what you recall of that
It's one of,
reunification with your mother?
that's probably the very first clear memory that I have. I had been asleep in one of the back rooms of the house, and then my foster sister Davy came to get me and carried me into the living room where the whole family had gathered in a circle. I was cranky, unhappy at having been awakened, and so they did what you do with a cranky child. You passed it from lap to lap, and that's what they did with me. But what I remember is that there was one lap I refused to sit in, one woman I kept pushing away, and that woman was my own mother because she was a complete stranger to me. My mother at that point was Mima Saina.
What was it like trying to rebuild a relationship with your mother after being separated from her at such a young age?
My mother decided that as a first step, it would be good for Mima to continue to take care of me. But then, sadly, at the end of September 30th, 1945, Mima passed away. This is a very remarkable photograph, by the way, that was also taken by Arthur Friederich's father. And it was taken the day after I was reunited with my mother. And you can see that it's Helga Friederici who is holding on to me, while my mother is still standing in the background. But gradually, actually very quickly after that, especially after Mima was taken away from us, I bonded very closely with my mother, and that really came quite easy. My mother, made it very easy. She told me that her reason for living, what gave her a reason to continue living, was having to take care of me.
Mhm. We haven't. Tell us a little bit about this photo.
Well, this photo was taken a few years later. Uh, my mother uh, initially tried to make a living selling some of the fabrics that were left behind from my father's business. But then eventually she acquired this cosmetic store, and that's how she continued. That's how she actually made a living. And here's a photograph, very nice photograph of the
Mhm.
two of us. But I'm probably about 7 or 8 years old.
Mm.
But my mother it was really remarkable how my mother adapted, if that's even the right word, after the loss of her husband and two daughters. And I don't know how she did it. Again, it is probably because, just like she said, she knew she had to take care of me. And it was really also part of her continuing defiance. She did not want Adolf Hitler to have the last word.
Al, do you know when your mom learned what really happened to her daughters and to her husband?
For my part, it took me a long time to realize what happened to my sisters. I would overhear conversations, people saying, well, such and such a person came back and that person did not come back. And I gradually came to understand that my sisters had been taken somewhere and did not come back. And eventually was able to find out that that meant they had been killed. I don't know exactly when my mother found out what happened to my sisters and my father. Details about my father probably she did not learn until about 1952. That's when she found out where he died and she visited Ebensee. For my sisters, shortly after her return to the Netherlands, my mother testified against or provided testimony against a man who had arrested my sisters. His name was Dirk Vas, and I viewed the criminal record. He was a Dutchman, and he was tried for treason. And my mother offered testimony, and then in the course of the testimony, she was asked by the examiner, and where are your daughters now? And her answer was, nog niet teruggekomen in Dutch, have not returned as yet. I don't know whether she was just saying that in the hope that my sisters might be alive, or whether she actually knew that my sisters had been killed.
Al, I have a final question for you today, and that is, in the face of rising global anti-Semitism, please tell us why you continue to tell and share your firsthand account of what you and your family experienced during the Holocaust.
The story of my family, like the story of a million families just like mine, shows the terrible consequences of hate and bigotry. And that's an important lesson that the world sadly still has to learn. And that's one reason I continue to tell the story. By the same token, the Monna family and all the others who tried to save my sisters and Rosa Mazurowski, and certainly the Polak family who had intervened with me, but especially the Madas, show that even when surrounded by a sea of hate, it is possible to do what is right. And that, too, I think, is a very important message, especially for young people. And that's, I think, what I hope will be the lesson that people will take from my story.